Hey all, welcome to another episode of Ball. Ball stands for Best Advice and Life Lessons, a podcast show where we focus on talking about the best advice and lessons from world-class leaders, writers, artists, performers, and entrepreneurs from various walks of life, mostly business and tech. The idea is to deconstruct and tease out their routines, habits, techniques, and the best advice or lesson that they have ever received that you as listeners can use and apply this to your own life and work. I'm actually more interested in learning about things my guests have never said or shared before. Today, I'm thrilled to have Walt Mossberg in this episode of Ball. So, Walt is a highly respected journalist, widely credited with pioneering the modern consumer focused technology review and commentary. Walt created one of the industry's earliest personal tech columns. We'll talk to him about that. That's been a model for many to follow. He covered four seminal events in the industry: the dawn of the PC, the dawn of the internet, the dawn of modern mobile devices as we know it, and again, the dawn of social media. So he is often known as the kingmaker of tech products, sometimes driving up stock prices up or down, like the famous XM satellite radio stock that plunged after Walt's column, proving that the pen is indeed mightier than sword. Few reviewers, writers have wielded so much power to shape an industry's successes or failures. So Walt's MO is posing as a champion of the normal tech user, though he's hardly one, and Kara Swisher calls him a freakish geek. Walt was a principal technology columnist for Wall Street Journal, also co-founded All Things D, Recode, and the D and Code conferences with Kara Swisher. He was the executive editor of The Verge, editor at large of Recode, websites owned by Vox Media. He wrote a weekly column for both and also a weekly podcast, Control Walt Delete. Currently, he serves on the board of the News Literacy Project, which we will ask him about. Walt is my absolute favorite personal tech journalist, and I grew up reading his reviews and watching his interviews with business and tech leaders. And when I asked him, he was absolutely gracious enough to be on my show. Welcome to the show, Walt. Let's play ball.
I'm delighted to be here, Srini, and I'm ready to play ball.
Thank you. I would be lying, Walt, if I said I wasn't a bit nervous talking to you or actually doing a podcast interview with you. I know you can do a masterclass on interviews, but here we are, and thanks again.
I think you'll do great. Don't worry about it.
Thank you. Let me start off. 2020 so far has been super crazy year, and we still have another month to go before the election frenzy. I hope you and your family are doing well. First of all, let's dive in. I'm very curious to learn if you can share your story. How did it all start? How did you get started? And if you can reflect back on any toughest or difficult periods of your life, what would that be? And are there any lessons or advice from that?
Well, I decided I wanted to become a journalist when I was in high school, and I actually started writing small articles for my local newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island. I grew up in one of the suburbs of Providence, and it was the kind of thing that's disappearing tragically now. It was a local newspaper. It had, if I remember, about maybe 250,000 circulation, but it had won 4 or 5 Pulitzer Prizes by the time I started there. And I only really worked there. I wrote this sort of high school column, and I worked there summers, but that's where I got my start. And my goal was to get a job covering Washington for one of the big 3 newspapers, which are still the big 3 newspapers today, either the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. So I went to the Columbia University Grad School of Journalism, and the Wall Street Journal hired me right out of there. And that was, I mean, my professors were ecstatic. I had other job offers. They told me to ignore all of them, go to the Wall Street Journal. I was instantly a national reporter on a national newspaper. The only hitch was they wouldn't send me to Washington right away. I had to prove myself in one of their smaller business-oriented bureaus, which they had all over the country in those days. And the one they sent me to was in Detroit, which was a very important bureau for them. They had 5 reporters permanently based in Detroit, which is quite a lot if you think about it. And we covered the car industry and the United Auto Workers and some other companies based in Michigan, and some in Ohio as well. And we also could write about politics or humorous things, whatever we saw and could report upon. And I learned a tremendous amount there. And I covered labor, and I covered a couple of national strikes, and learned a lot about that. And I wrote some political stories there, because Michigan, even then, was an important state in national elections. And after about 3.5 years, I did get transferred to Washington. And I had for 18 years in Washington, I had a series of beats covering various parts of the government, starting with the labor agencies in the federal government, the Labor Department, and the National Labor Relations Board and all that, because that's what I had covered in Detroit. So it was a perfect transition. But then I covered the environment. I covered the EPA. I covered energy when the Energy Department was brand new. I was the chief Pentagon correspondent. I was the chief international economics correspondent. So I covered the Treasury. I covered the Fed. I covered the Treasury when James Baker was the Treasury Secretary, and I covered the Fed when Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Fed. I used to have interviews with Alan Greenspan and then walk out of the interview and try to figure out what he had just said to me, because I couldn't always figure it out. And then I became what we called the national security correspondent. And really my job was to cover the Cold War primarily. And at the time that I got the job, which was in the late 80s, and it ended in the early 90s, I had the good fortune to be covering the end of the Cold War, the victory of the West over the communist states in the Cold War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany. And so I had the good fortune to be able to write about and to witness some major events. I was in and out of Moscow often because I traveled with the Secretary of State, who was also James Baker. By then, he had changed from Treasury to State. And so I was writing articles that got a lot of readership and were very important, and I was really writing about the end of a 50-year epoch in history. But privately, I had become a computer hobbyist, which was very strange because I had no interest in it, had never taken a computer science course in college, not even a math course. I had placed out of math, so I didn't take a math course in college or grad school. And I knew nothing about computers, but one day I bought a $99 computer called the Timex Sinclair, which was actually invented in the UK. And it didn't have, it had 1K or 2K of RAM, and no storage, no internal storage of any kind. It didn't even have a floppy drive. You had to use a cassette recorder. Some of your listeners will not even know what I'm talking about, Srini. I think you probably do. You had to go buy a cassette recorder at Radio Shack, another name which is gone, and plug it into this thing. You plugged a black and white TV in for your monitor. And it actually, I learned BASIC so I could do a little coding, although I learned no other computer languages subsequently, and I cannot code today. And I got familiar with and fascinated by computers. This first computer had no communications ability. There was no modem available for it. This was in 1981, I think. So I saved my money, and a couple of years later, I bought an Apple IIe, which was a more refined model of the original Apple II. I think it had 128K, not megabytes, not gigabytes, kilobytes of memory. And it did have floppy disk drives and a color monitor and a real keyboard. And there I learned to do things inside the hardware, like add memory, and I added cards. The first product I ever bought from Microsoft was actually not software. In those days, Microsoft made a card, a hardware card for the Apple II, which went into a slot because every computer had slots to add capabilities. You would buy these cards and plug them into the slots. And the one Microsoft made allowed the Apple II to run a different operating system, an additional operating system to its native one. And that operating system allowed it to run a program called Word Smart, which was the leading word processor. So I did that, and I actually soldered certain things inside the computer. So I got my hands dirty, and I did that. And then I bought a DOS computer, and then I bought a Mac, and so I just became a computer hobbyist for about 10 years. And in 1991, I had the idea to start a computer and technology column in the Wall Street Journal with a different premise than the columns that were in other newspapers. And the premise was most of the columns in the other newspapers were written by geeks, for geeks, by techies, for techies, and they had a lot of jargon in them. And I wanted to make my column be the column that championed, as you mentioned earlier, the average user, not a stupid person, not a person who was afraid of computers, but a person who had no interest in learning about how the computer worked, no interest in learning coding, no interest in ever opening the computer. They just wanted to use it for entertainment, for productivity, for whatever they were going to do with it. And I wanted to not be reverential about the industry, which I think I thought in those days had made computers too hard to use and were ignoring this very, very large group of people. And then the Wall Street Journal allowed me to do that, so that's what I did.
Wow, that's awesome, Walt. How you made that pivot? And on that note, did you know that it would become such a big hit that it did? Or was it something that you were experimenting with, or you knew that the industry was going? What led you to do that?
Well, look, the personal computer, the mass market personal computer, that is a computer that you did not have to be an engineer to use, and that wasn't a kit, started in 1977. There were three of them: the Commodore PET, the Radio Shack something computer, I don't remember the name of the model, and the Apple II. And of those three, the Apple II had the biggest impact. It had the first spreadsheet, which was called VisiCalc, and which was a third-party app, but it made a very big difference. A lot of small businesses bought Apple IIs to use it. And it also lasted the longest. I think it died in the 1990s or something. So they sold a lot of them proportional to the kind of sales computers had in those days. So by the time I started my column in 1991, computers had been around, personal computers had been around for 14 years. We had the graphical user interface and mouse with the Mac, and then about a year and a half with Windows 1.0. And we were well past that. Windows 3.0 was, I think, right around that time. And so computers weren't brand new when I started my column, but they had not been democratized. They were mostly in companies and some schools, and of course some homes, but most of the readers of the Wall Street Journal, most people, families, did not have a real capable personal computer. And I believed, this was an argument I made to my editors, that this was going to just explode and democratize. And you could look up the figures of what percent of Americans or people globally had personal computers in 1991, but it wasn't very high. I did believe that a majority in the next decade or so were going to have personal computers, and that nobody was helping average people understand how to use them. And that I had to belong to both offline and online user groups to figure out how to use my various computers. I had put in hundreds of hours learning it. It was a hobby, so that was fine, but these people had lives to lead, they had other things to do, and they needed someone to help guide them through this. And there was actually a war at the Wall Street Journal. I learned later, I didn't know it at the time, where some of the editors, the very top editor was fully in favor of my column, but some of his deputies tried to talk him out of it. They thought technology wasn't important enough to deserve a column. I insisted on being on the front of a section, which was a prime real estate in the newspaper. They didn't want to do that. It was a war. And so if the column had flopped, let's say within 6 months, I would have probably, they would have probably canceled it, and I would have gone back to being a regular reporter covering something else. But I would say the column became a big hit within as little as 10 weeks or 11 weeks. It happened, they were doing a readership study around that time and found out that my column, which was practically brand new, was already the number 2 or 3 most read thing in the newspaper. So they really couldn't kill it, and I was secure from that point on.
Wow, and explode it did, and how? That was, it was a staple column for me at least, and a lot of us every week waiting for your column. Definitely. Walt, I know it was a big risk for you at the time when you switched, and it was a complete pivot from what you were doing, shifting over to a tech column and basically reinventing that particular space, if you will. How do you go about choosing your projects or pieces that you did or you say no to? Can you walk me through that process when you got started? I'm sure.
Absolutely, and I think since this is a podcast where we are giving advice to people or talking about lessons we've learned, one of the big lessons that I have conveyed many times to people starting companies or journalists starting new ventures is you have to have focus. You have to make some scoping decisions right at the beginning of your project. And for me, I made a firm decision, which I never changed in 27 years of writing this column in various places, which was you can't cover everything. So I was only going to cover consumer technology products that were available to and meant for use by average consumers. Even if enterprises also use them, as long as there was a significant consumer audience for the product, I would consider reviewing it. But if it was a pure B2B product or enterprise software, let's say to use a current example, Slack or Teams or Salesforce or any of Oracle's products. It's not that I had anything against those products, but for the purposes of my focus, which I think is hugely important in any endeavor you're doing, you have to have a focus. I was just not going to review those things. And so every week when I would sit down to think about my topic and to think about start writing, I was able to know exactly who I was writing for and not have to try to satisfy the IT guy at Ford Motor Company in what his job or her job was, at the same time as I was trying to satisfy a person who wanted to use a computer at home or in their very, very tiny business, like a 3-person travel agency or something. That was my audience. The latter was my audience. And the guy at Ford Motor, it turned out unexpectedly for me that the guy at Ford Motor read the column anyway, and partly because his CEO read the column. But that was not my audience. So that was that was, to answer your question, that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, week to week, how do I decide what product to write about? Because there's too many products to fit in a weekly column, 48 weeks a year if you take some vacation. And I wrote, my column was on Thursday, so I never had a column on Thanksgiving, of course. So that was 1 week I never had a column. And the answer to that is just, I tried to write about 2 kinds of things, whether they were hardware or software or services. One was something that I thought moved the needle, that was different than what had come before, an entirely new. In the old days, you could have an entirely new category of product that no one had thought of before, and there was a lot of that, or an existing category which did it with a bunch of features that made it much better than what had come before. And I'll give you 2 examples. Microsoft Word, I think, was Word 6, I thought moved the needle really significantly in word processing. And word processing had been around since the late 70s and the early 80s. But Microsoft Word, it was whatever version had automatic on-the-fly spell checking, for instance, and a few other things like that. And so, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have reviewed another word processor or another rev of an existing word processor, but that moved the needle. Another example, which is, I think, more obvious and more recent, was the iPhone. I mean, there were so-called so-called smartphones before the iPhone, but nobody had ever seen anything with an interface like the iPhone and a browser like the iPhone had and a bunch of other things the iPhone had. And so obviously that was a no-brainer. That had to be a major review.
Got it. I mean, those are excellent examples. Well, thanks for sharing that. In your previous segment, you talked about the memory piece. The one thing I wanted to call up is, I don't know if this is true or not, but some years back, I mean, people have said that Bill Gates said 640 kilobytes of memory is more than anyone will ever need.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that is true or not, but hey,
I didn't hear him say it, but I remember that. Yep.
Yeah, got it. Hey, one more tidbit, Walt. I don't know. I haven't told you this. I think I mentioned about my email to you about 17 years ago. You may not remember. And because you mentioned about the focus, I mean, you were focused on personal technology column. So my email to you 17 years ago, and this is a little bit of a tidbit for the listeners as well that they may not know, was, hey, Walt, would you be interested in me being an apprentice and starting a business technology column? Because I was all about business tech, enterprise software. And you were kind enough to reply at the time. You may not remember that. But it didn't go, it didn't have legs. It didn't go far. I don't think it would have been successful given the focus of enterprise software versus a consumer tech column. But I thought it was interesting I'd mentioned that to you.
Well, the truth is, I tried. I mean, in those days, email was the only real or certainly the principal way you communicated digitally. Maybe it still is. I don't know, but it was certainly then. And I tried to answer all my email, particularly from readers and from people, who had startups in mind. Obviously, I reviewed everything important that Microsoft did. I reviewed everything important that Apple did, later Google, the Amazon, the big giant companies. But I reviewed hundreds and hundreds of products from startups, some with as few as 2 people in them, if I thought they were great products. And some of them you never heard of again after a while, and some of them became big deals. For instance, if we think about the pandemic right now, and Zoom has become a word almost in the language, I did the first review of Zoom in 2012. I was the first journalist they showed it to, and I gave it a good review. It was, a consumer version of Zoom at that time, and now it's, well, until the pandemic, it was primarily an enterprise product because they always had in mind going to enterprise, and now school children are using it. Everybody's using it. So you just have to make a call. First, you have to make a call on your overall mission and focus, and then you have to make a call on what is the most important thing to do or not do. And here I'll quote Steve Jobs, who I think had tremendous wisdom about a lot of this stuff. He said, more than once, but he said it to me in one of my interviews I did with him at one of my conferences. He said, "I'm prouder of the things we have decided not to do than I am of the things we've decided that we would do."
Wow, that's great wisdom. Talking about that, in fact, I was going to check in with you. I know throughout your career you met a lot of people, business and tech leaders, spent a lot of quality time. I'm sure you have met Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. I'm more curious. I think the audience will be very curious as well in terms of your take. Is there any story or lesson that stands out from meeting them? And what's your take in terms of any similarities or differences? And what is it that we can learn from them?
Well, I knew many people, and some of them, to be very honest, have not gotten the credit they deserve. Before I talk about Jobs and Gates, who everybody knows, there was a guy named Jeff Hawkins, who is still the head of a company. His current company is trying to do brain research and stuff I don't even entirely understand, but Jeff Hawkins invented
the Palm guy, the Palm
Pilot, which was the first pocket computer. I think what I said in my review, this is the first pocket computer I would ever consider owning and carrying, and many people did, but he couldn't get any VC funding. He had to actually sell the company. He actually sold it to a modem company in Illinois in order to have the capital to launch the Palm Pilot. And then he and his business partner, Donna Dubinsky, started a company called Handspring, and they developed the Trio, which was, in my opinion, better than the Microsoft phone, better than the BlackBerry, and probably the best smartphone before the iPhone. So he doesn't get credit for those things. A lot of people have never heard his name. Another guy who I think matters a lot is Philippe Kahn, who was an immigrant from France, became a citizen, of course, a long time ago. And he still has a company, but he had an office suite that competed fiercely with Microsoft Office for years in the old days. It was a company called Borland. He also had languages that Borland published, and computer languages, and those competed with Microsoft. But perhaps the most interesting thing he did, which he doesn't get credit for, is he essentially invented the camera phone. He sent the first photo taken with a phone. It was kind of a rigged up job where he wired a camera to a Motorola phone and figured out the software necessary to do it. And he took a picture, a very fuzzy picture of his baby daughter, who's now a grown woman, and sent it to a number of people. I was one of them. And he doesn't get credit either. A lot of people today don't know who he is. But you asked me about lessons and similarities and differences between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. So they were very different people. I say were because obviously we've lost Jobs. Bill, is still very active, although not in software so much. And so they were different people. Steve Jobs was laser focused on consumers, and he believed he needed to build the whole thing, the software, the hardware, and that design was as important as engineering, all of the things about him from the books that have been written about him and the movies and whatever. So that was him. Bill believed that software was the key. He once told me he thought hardware, meaning computers themselves, personal computers themselves, was a sucker's game. He told me that in a private interview once, that the margin was much too small and the differentiation was much too difficult. And these companies that made this stuff were his partners. so he didn't say it publicly, but he thought it was a sucker's game. I don't think he might, I'm not sure he would have approved of the Surface devices that Microsoft makes now. Not that he would have thought they were bad devices. I'm sure he probably uses them, but I'm not sure he would have approved going into that business. They always made at Microsoft keyboards and mice, but that was the extent of their hardware business for a long time. So, and they also talked, there were lawsuits and between the two companies, and they talked trash about each other privately, but they had a level of respect for each other. What was similar about them, and a lesson that I learned, not only from them, but from others, but especially from them, since without them, we wouldn't have had the personal computers that the revolution that began in the late 70s, and which led to mobile and, as you said, and the internet and social media and all those things are dependent on what those two guys did. They were both in some ways megalomaniacs. I mean, in order to get a new idea like the personal computer, like the Mac, the graphic user interface, like Windows, like a software company which had not existed before Microsoft, primarily or purely a software company, you had to be at some point, first of all, you had to be utterly determined, and you had to be, in some cases, a jerk. I mean, they both had chips on their shoulders. They felt the world was against them, and they felt that they were changing the world, and they were not always so nice to other people, including people that worked for them that had been with them for a long time. And there are numerous stories about both of them in this regard. Jobs called a bunch of when he came back to Apple for the second time and saved the company, he said he had to get rid of a lot of people he called bozos. And he said that publicly. And Bill was famous for saying to people, sometimes people who were like employee number 4, he would say in meetings, "That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard." And just go off on people about that. So I think that was a similarity. In 1977, in 2007, on the 30th anniversary of the Apple II, which, by the way, had Microsoft software in it, Microsoft Basic, which a lot of people don't know. There was a collaboration to that extent. In 2007, I convinced both of them to go on stage together. And in that interview, you could see that there was a mutual respect. They took some shots at each other, but there was a mutual respect for what each other had accomplished.
Got it. Thank you, Walt. I think that is a lot of good insights, and you're absolutely right in terms of Hawkins and Khan. I think some of that was actually the turning point in some of those devices, both Palm Pilot as well as camera phones that we probably were not aware of. So thanks for reminding. Switching gears, Walt, I'd love to get your take in the current environment today, right? What does good journalism mean in the day of social media, fake news, how news is consumed? I know you are on the board of the News Literacy Project. Can you share a little bit about that, and what are you most excited about that?
Well, let me first talk about news literacy. First of all, the News Literacy Project is 12 years old. I did not start it. It was started by a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times. And he started it because he felt that kids in school were not getting any guidance on how to distinguish fact from fiction in what they were reading online, and that they also didn't understand journalism, the role of quality journalism, at least in our democratic system. And so he started it by having journalists visit classrooms. And I got a call out of the blue one day to do that, which is how I came to know the organization before I was on the board. And then we eventually, in 2016, created a digital curriculum. This is before the pandemic, where teaching was still done in person for the most part, but many schools supplied students with computers, and our curriculum ran on those computers, or the teacher could just project it onto a screen for the whole class if everybody didn't have a computer. And the curriculum, which is called Checkology, teaches how to distinguish fact from fiction, from how to recognize misinformation and hoaxes and conspiracy theories, and why you shouldn't share them, even if your best friend forwarded it to you. How you can quickly check it out, and how you should restrain yourself from sharing it so it doesn't get more credence and more. You understand how something going viral works. It's almost logarithmic. And so if you can stop even a few people from sharing, you've stopped a whole bunch of people from possibly seeing something false. So that's one of the things we teach. We also, the students are in the lessons, they're put in the position of being a reporter and an editor, and they have to, we create a scenario. It's nothing political. We're nonpartisan. So it's, we make up some story about a car crash or something, and they have to write a story about it. And they realize that people, even well-meaning people, have different memories of the event, and how do they figure out what really happened, what they should report. And then when they're an editor, they have to decide, well, which story is more important than which other story in my laying out my homepage of my website. And so they learn about journalism. And then we have lessons about the First Amendment, and which most students and most adults, I think, don't know what's in the First Amendment. And we have stories about the difficulties journalists have in other countries, some other countries, where they get arrested and sometimes killed, and this sort of thing. So that's what the News Literacy Project does. This year, just in the last month, we have decided to go beyond the walls of schools, and we've developed a bunch of resources to try to bring these lessons to the general public. It's harder to change the mind of a 40-year-old person than a kid in the 10th grade. Kid in the 10th grade still has a somewhat malleable mind, and you can teach them critical thinking and news literacy. But when you're 40 and you are in a bubble on Twitter or Facebook, it can be hard, but we're going to take it on. And so we have an adult version of Checkology. We have a new podcast. We have a new newsletter, and we have an app, an iOS and Android app called Informable. And I'm on the executive committee of the board. I'm in the leadership, and it's a small organization. It's about 25 people, but we're pushing, and we're hoping to teach people to be literate about the news as they are about the language or math. In terms of quality journalism, the question you asked me, I don't think the core of it is different than it used to be. You still are required to do real reporting, get the actual facts, and double check them and triple check them and have an editor go over it with you and be sure that you are right. And if you make a mistake, quickly correct it, publicly correct it and apologize. Whether you're in print, like we were in the old days and still are today to some extent, or whether you're online. And I wrote policies on that when I left the Wall Street Journal and when we started All Things D, all of those things. You have to have ethics. I don't think journalists covering a company or an industry or a political party should be involved with those organizations. For 47 years, I never owned a tech stock because it was a firing offense and because it was unethical. The difference today is, I think, where we have a president who is prone to telling lies and supporting conspiracy theories. Journalists have to tell the truth. And in the old days, it was where we didn't have this situation and we had merely different philosophies about what to do about the facts. We didn't have disputes about what was true. It was fine to say the Republicans have put forward this proposal. Here's what the Democrats have to say about it, or the management says this, and the union says that. You know, whatever. Give both sides an opportunity. Today, I think you were by doing that, you were giving the reader the truth. Today, to give the reader the truth, you may have to say this side is telling a lie, and you might have to back it up with reporting as to why it's a lie. If the president says, I never found out about COVID until, I don't know, and I'm not trying to be precise about this. I'm just using this as an example. I may have the dates wrong. I never heard about it till March, but now there's proof he heard about it in February or January. You can say he was lying when he said what he said about March, and here's what we know that proves that he was lying. And unless Biden told the same lie, you don't say the Democrat says the same thing, you know. So we have to make some adjustments for our democracy. I'm not saying that reporters should be on one side or the other, unless they are opinion columnists, which is a legitimate form of journalism. In fact, my technology reviews were opinion columns because in the end I said, this product is good or bad, or you should buy this and not this. But they have to be based on reporting. And so I think we have to make some changes. And as far as clickbait, I mean, that's a phenomenon of the rise of online publication. And I think headlines that are far from what's really in the article need to be banned in quality journalism, and even if it means less traffic.
I agree, Walt. I think there's a lot in terms of, I think there used to be a term, the fourth estate, right, which is the fourth power, if you will. It may be a little bit arcane, but I think... well,
it's still true. I mean, the term may be arcane, but it's still true.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. The one switching gears again, what are the things that set of habits or routines that were important to you that made you who you are. Many a time, successful people and people who are good at their trade and their art and their craftsmanship have certain discipline, set of rituals and habits. What was yours? I'd love to learn what did you what are some of those things that we can learn from?
Well, I may be the wrong person to ask. I'm a very last minute person. I thought of my topics in advance, although I didn't have months of, or even weeks of, usually of lists of, well, I have to cover this week and I have to cover this next week. Obviously, in many cases, I would have to be testing weeks in advance, sometimes months in advance. So I knew I was going to have to write about it when the company lifted the embargo or the product was about to go on sale or whatever the deal was. But my habit was to nail down the factual reporting first. So know all the specs, interview the company, understand why they designed the product this way and what they were aiming for. Audience, what was their focus? What did they think of their competitors? Why were they better than their competitors? Did they think they had no competitors? I didn't always agree with that. You'd be amazed how many people say they don't have any competitors. And then do very thorough testing of the product and then come to a judgment in my mind about how this product would fit into the lives of average people, mainstream users, and then write my column with my opinion. And I wrote almost all my columns over 27 years the day before they were due, and turned them in the morning they were due. I never wrote them and filed them a week in advance unless I was going on vacation or something. And so that was my routine.
Got it. I mean, in some ways, I think it was Adam Grant, a Wharton School of Business professor, who said, I think he said, it may be counterintuitive, but why you should procrastinate more, because it leads to a lot of creativity. Even though it may be last minute, I think the argument is, hey, while procrastination is a vice for productivity, I think there's a lot, actually it's a virtue for creativity. People are very creative because you have to squeeze in a lot within a short time frame, and then you come up with a lot of ideas. Very interesting to learn that.
Well, I agree with you, and especially in a field like technology, which moves very fast. If I had written my columns weeks in advance, it would have been actually in many ways unfair to the companies, because they were working toward a ship date. There was usually an embargo date before people like me could print our reviews, so they were conscious of that, usually pretty close to the ship date. But if the product had problems, and I wrote it 3 weeks in advance, I might have said it's a terrible product, but they might have patched it and fixed it before they shipped. And what I was complaining about might not have ever been viewed by the reader. And so by waiting, I got the benefit of any improvements and finishing touches they made on the product. And if in my mind I had run into problem X and problem X went away, I never had to mention it to the reader, because the reader would never see problem X. It was gone. And that was better for me in terms of being honest with the readers, and better for the company in terms of not having to take blame in a very large, trusted newspaper and news organization online for something they had already fixed. So there were many advantages to waiting. It did make editors nervous, though.
I'm sure, whether you're going to make it or not. Deadlines are
I
important.
always made it. I never missed a deadline.
I'm sure you did. Um, Hey, one other question I had. I mean, being in the industry that you have been in, which is, hey, this is an always on age, and you were deeply into technology. Are there any techniques that you use to really unplug or go off the grid? And if so, how did you do that? How would you do that? What are some of the tactics? Or are you fine in terms of some people are fine managing, being constantly on the phone or emails and chats all the time, even when they have a break? How do you balance those two?
Well, I've never developed an actual system. If you can't tell by now, I'm not very good at having systems. But when I'm in with my family, and now it's just my wife and I because our children are grown, when we're spending time together, we try not to look at our phones, and certainly don't have computers open in front of us, or iPads or anything like that. So it just almost comes naturally. I read, I watch TV. Before the pandemic, I went out to eat and went to the movies and things like that. And I'm not one of those people who put his phone on the table when I ate. If I was waiting for you to appear at our lunch, I might be looking at my Twitter or my email. But once you got there, I wasn't interrupting our conversation to do that. And so that's about it. And so I am off the grid parts of the time, but I don't have a system for it exactly. Srini, can we talk a little about two subjects that I never learned in journalism school, but that were very important in my career and were big lessons I learned?
Sure.
So one of them is entrepreneurialism, which is very familiar, I'm sure, to many of your listeners in the tech industry. And remember, I'm really not part of the tech industry. Some people have said that to me, but I'm really an observer of the tech industry. But I believe journalists and many other people who haven't been used to it have to be entrepreneurial. You have to be willing to start new things, new ventures. Sometimes it's a company. You quit a big stable job you had at a big company and you go off to start something new. And I did that. Sometimes it's creating something new within a big company where you have considerable autonomy, but also a lot at stake in the success of the venture. And I did that a couple of times while at the Wall Street Journal. First, as we've already discussed, with my tech column. And secondly, when my friend Kara Swisher and I started All Things Digital, which began as a series of conferences and continued as conferences, but also eventually became a website and an app. And even though it was owned by Dow Jones, so we didn't have any equity in it, we were compensated to a degree that was much, 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 much greater than a journalist typically makes, because we did all the work and we came up with the ideas and we hired an entire staff, none of whom worked in the beginning at the Wall Street Journal or its parent company. And we had technically we were reporting to somebody in the hierarchy of the company, but we rarely did it, and they never interfered with us. So you can be entrepreneurial inside an organization, or you can quit and start something. But it's very important to think about creating your own dream job and work, and being your own boss in a way. To me, I think it's more and more important, and particularly in an industry which is in such trouble as journalism. Secondly, the other thing I never learned anywhere in journalism school or from my mentors was the idea of being a brand. I think if you're only interested in being a brand and you're not putting in the work or the quality, that's bad and it's worthless. And there are people on YouTube, you can see it probably most readily, who only want to be a brand and don't have much to offer. And I'm being very broad about this.
Sure.
Don't have very much to offer, whether it's humor, whether it's gossip, whether it's news, whether it's entertainment, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's music, I don't know what it is. There are people with a lot to offer, and there are people with almost nothing to offer. So it's not a good idea to just try to be a brand. But if you do have something to offer, and I'm now talking about journalism specifically, you also have to pay attention to your brand, separate from the brand of the organization you work for, if you do work for an organization. It doesn't have to be antithetical. It can actually be mutually supportive. You can support but by having a big trusted brand, you can be helpful to the larger organization, but you're also helpful to yourself, and their brand is also helpful to you. And so I learned those things, and I accomplished both of those things. In the case of the entrepreneurial thing, I did it several times, and today, when I'm asked for advice by students or young journalists, I tell them about these things. But 30 years ago, if I was sitting in a newsroom and somebody said, "Oh, Mossberg, you have to be a brand," I would have thrown them out. So I think those are important things in journalism.
Now, those are super valuable pieces of advice, Walt. Being entrepreneurial, and you can do that even within the confines of a larger corporation or an organization or a company. And the second thing is equally important for folks who it's personal brand, building your own personal brand. And I think you did that long before it was a thing, if you will. In fact, I was going to ask you about some of those advice. What advice would you offer to young writers or entrepreneurs or journalists? I think you answered those questions. Are there anything else that you would like to offer?
No, I think just get it right. Whether you're starting a company that, I don't know, produces a gadget or a piece of software or some other industry that I'm not as familiar with, get it right. Do your homework. Talk to customers and get it right. And then you can someday maybe be rich. And then work your ass off and be prepared for some serious risk. If you're not willing to take a risk, or you can't take a financial or reputational risk, then don't do it. But if you are willing to do those things, you will have a better chance of succeeding. And for journalists, get it right is hugely important. And then the other thing, I'll just be repetitive and say, and this applies to journalism and everything else, have focus. If you're the person at Amazon who's in charge of, I don't know, apparel, selling apparel, or you're the person who's in charge of the cloud service, you better have focus and make sure that you're right there in tune with your audience and that you know who your audience is and that you're providing what your audience needs. And the same is true of journalists.
No, that's great advice. Got it. In fact, the one question that I wanted to ask you was, well, those are your advice. Is there any best advice that you have ever gotten that you would like to share? That when you were growing up or later in your career, something that you remember, which is the best advice that you got?
Yes, the best advice. Well, I mean, my parents taught me not to lie. And I'm not saying I'm a perfect person, but I will tell you that not lying and not saying anything bigoted were the two biggest sins in my household growing up. Other than that, the most important advice I ever got was question authority and then question it again. I learned that as a college student, and it applies today, whether it's the government or your own company or your, any institution, whether it's the media, whether it's, a religion, it just doesn't matter. Question authority. It doesn't mean you won't come out thinking the authority is generally right, but you might come out thinking the authority is wrong, either generally or on a particular issue. But you need to question authority. And that is a key to quality journalism. And I think it's a key to a lot of things.
Got it. Thank you, Walt. On that note, I know we are over time, but thank you so much for your time today, Walt. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And Srini, I know you have a day job. That's very important, but you're a pretty good interviewer, so keep at it.
Thank you, Walt. And yeah, this is a passion for me in terms of talking to folks who can actually share their learning, and it's part of the giving. I think you're giving as well. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.